The molten lead had a quality that no other metal replicated, a thick, almost organic viscosity that made the material flow from the crucible, not like water, but like heated honey. The ideal temperature for molding was not measured by a thermometer. It was recognized by the way the surface of the liquid metal reflected light, a matte silvery sheen without the tremor that indicated excessive heat. Experienced soldiers knew that too hot lead produced air bubbles in the bullet. Too cold lead did not completely fill the corners of the mold. The exact point was when the metal stopped bubbling and acquired a dense, viscous stillness. It was a visual reading that the eyes learned to make before the mind could explain it. Before you ask, how the hell did anyone discover that this was the ideal temperature? Spoiler, it was trial and error and a lot of deformed bullets thrown away. If you want to see more of these stories of how we discovered this the worst way possible, subscribe to the channel. Pouring the molten lead into the iron mold required a proximity to the heat that left permanent marks. The steam that rose from the crucible carried a sweet metallic smell, not exactly unpleasant, but persistent, sticking to the back of the throat. Hands needed to be steady enough to avoid spillage, but far enough away so that the radiant heat did not burn the exposed skin of the forearms. Soldiers who regularly made bullets developed a darkened pigmentation on the backs of their hands, not from direct burns, but from repeated exposure to the intense heat that permanently altered the skin's melanin. It was a mark of craftsmanship as recognizable as the calluses of a rower. The sound of the molten lead entering the mold was a brief hiss, almost imperceptible. The contact between liquid metal at 327 degrees Celsius and cold iron created an instant thermal reaction that released invisible steam. In the first few seconds after the pour, the surface of the still liquid bullet inside the mold formed a thin film that wrinkled slightly, like skin forming over boiling milk. Soldiers knew they could not open the mold until that surface stopped moving. Opening too soon resulted in deformed bullets with irregular depressions that would affect the trajectory. Opening too late allowed the lead to stick to the iron, making extraction difficult and damaging the mold. The timing was bodily, counted not in seconds, but in breaths. 3 complete breaths, never less, rarely more. The iron mold was still hot when the hands opened it. Not hot enough to burn, but hot enough to leave the skin of the palm slightly red, with that feeling of heat that continued to pulse even after releasing the metal. The newly formed bullet came out of the mold with a fine flash, an irregular crest of lead that had escaped through the junction between the two halves of the mold. This flash needed to be removed manually, scraped with the blade of a knife or pulled off with the nails. The still warm lead was soft enough to yield under moderate pressure, but resilient enough to require force with the fingers. Soldiers who made dozens of bullets a day developed specific calluses on the sides of their thumbs and index fingers, exactly where the flash was pinched and twisted off. The texture of the freshly molded bullet was oddly matte, almost porous. Pure lead, when solidifying, did not acquire the metallic sheen of iron or bronze. The surface had a matte quality, slightly granular, that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Running a finger over the still warm bullet left a friction sensation, not rough like sandpaper, but with a subtle resistance that made the skin of the fingers drag slightly instead of slide. This texture was intentional. Perfectly smooth bullets slipped when being loaded into the barrel. The slightly irregular surface of the lead provided enough friction to keep the bullet pressed against the powder during loading. It was a functional imperfection that soldiers learned to recognize by touch before visually inspecting. Cooling completely took longer than most expected. Even 5 minutes after leaving the mold, the center of the bullet still retained residual heat, not enough to burn, but enough to be noticeable when held for an extended period in the closed palm. Soldiers who tried to speed up the process by dipping hot bullets in water found that the thermal shock created invisible microcracks. These bullets disintegrated unpredictably upon impact, not due to the controlled expansion that soft lead was supposed to produce, but due to chaotic fragmentation. Patience was measured by temperature. When the bullet could be held comfortably for 10 seconds without needing to change hands, it was ready. Not before. The body served as the final thermometer. A pure lead musket ball weighed on average 28 grams, the equivalent of 5 stacked copper. Coins, but condensed into a sphere smaller than a walnut. The density of lead was what made this weight surprising. Holding the ball for the first time created an immediate sensory discrepancy. The brain expected something light based on its size, but the hand received a concentrated, dense weight that seemed to want to sink through the palm. Soldiers compared the feeling to holding a wet river stone, not just heavy, but with a type of weight that felt active, demanding constant attention not to be dropped. It was a weight that the fingers had to actively squeeze to hold, not something that simply rested passively in the hand. The difference between pure lead and adulterated lead was recognized instantly by the weight. Dishonest suppliers often mixed tin or antimony with lead to increase profit, cheaper metals that reduced the final density. A ball that should weigh 28 grams but weighed 25 was not just 3 grams lighter. It was noticeably different when held. Experienced soldiers developed a muscular calibration so precise that they could detect variations of 2 grams simply by holding the ball and making a light swaying motion with their hand. The muscle of the palm and the tendons of the wrist learned the correct weight through repetition. Hundreds, then thousands of balls, held, loaded, fired. The body became a living scale. Balls that were too light were discarded immediately. Not out of perfectionism, but because adulterated lead did not deform correctly. And lead that did not deform killed in a different way. Carrying 20 balls in the inner pockets of the coat created an asymmetric weight distribution that the body needed to compensate for. 560 grams concentrated on one side slightly pulled the shoulder down, forcing the back muscles to continuously adjust to maintain balance. Soldiers marching long distances with ammunition distributed the balls equally between both sides, not out of organization, but because the muscular imbalance caused chronic lower back pain that started as a slight discomfort in the 3rd hour of marching and became a sharp pain by the 6th. Lead was not just dense. It was heavy in a way that accumulated, that multiplied, that turned 20 small spheres into a load that the shoulders and spine carried kilometer after kilometer. The weight of lead became part of the soldier's posture, shoulders slightly hunched forward, spine compensating sideways. Even without the balls, the body maintained the shape that the weight had molded. Testing the purity of lead was not done with instruments. It was done with teeth. Experienced soldiers lightly bit the surface of the freshly made ball, not hard enough to deform it completely, but with enough pressure to leave a mark. Pure lead easily yielded under the pressure of molars, leaving a clear impression of the dental grooves. The sensation in the mouth was distinctive. Lead had an almost paste-like malleability that compressed without resisting, without the metallic snap that iron or bronze produced. The taste was slightly sweet and metallic at the same time, not exactly unpleasant, but disturbing in its strangeness. The saliva that came into contact with lead acquired a slightly viscous texture that stuck to the roof of the mouth. If the ball resisted too much to the bite, if it did not leave a deep mark, it was adulterated lead. And adulterated lead did not expand correctly. Malleability was also tested by manual deformation. Soldiers would take a ball and press it between the thumb and the base of the palm, applying progressive force. Pure lead began to visibly flatten under moderate pressure. The sphere gradually transformed into an irregular disc, its sides flattening as the material yielded and flowed to the sides. The deformation was not elastic. Lead did not return to its original shape. Once compressed, it stayed compressed. This irreversibility was exactly what made the material ideal for bullets. If lead could be permanently deformed by the force of human hands, imagine what would happen when it encountered the resistance of bone and muscle at high speed. The malleability felt on the fingers was the same property that would cause devastation inside the body. Pure lead also had a characteristic temperature to the touch. Even at room temperature, holding a lead ball for a few seconds left the sensation that the metal was slightly colder than expected. Not cold like steel, but with a type of persistent chill that drained heat from the palm faster than other metals. This thermal conductivity was another way to verify purity. Adulterated lead with tin retained heat differently, heated faster in the hands, losing the characteristic touch of persistent cold. Soldiers developed a thermal memory in their palms. They knew how pure lead should feel against the skin, not just by weight or malleability, but by how it stole heat from the fingers. It was a multiple. Sensory calibration, weight, texture, temperature, resistance to deformation. The entire body became an instrument of quality control. Forcing the bullet down the barrel of the musket required more force than any military manual described. The lead bullet, with a diameter slightly smaller than the internal caliber of the barrel, needed to be pushed along with a scrap of cloth, the so-called patch, which created a seal between the bullet and the rifled barrel. The process began by positioning the patch over the mouth of the barrel, then placing the bullet on top and pushing both with the wooden ramrod. The initial resistance was deceptive. The first few centimeters went down relatively easily. But as the bullet advanced down the barrel and the patch compressed against the internal grooves, the friction increased exponentially. The ramrod needed to be pushed with the base of the palm, not just with the fingers. Strength came from the shoulder, from the weight of the body, leaning over the weapon. The sound was a muffled, continuous creaking, like rubbing cork against glass. The pressure required to complete the loading left marks. The base of the palm of the hand pushing the ramrod developed circular calluses, exactly where the tip of the wooden ramrod rested during the repeated effort. These were not superficial calluses. They were deep skin thickening, forming a permanent pad. Soldiers who loaded muskets for years had asymmetrical hands. The dominant hand used to push the ramrod had a visibly thicker palm, more rigid, less sensitive to touch. The skin there lost elasticity, becoming almost horn-like, yellowed. Shaking the hand of a veteran soldier meant feeling this difference. A palm that did not yield smoothly under pressure, but resisted with an unnatural hardness. During loading, the lead began to deform. The pressure of the ramrod against the surface of the bullet, combined with the friction of the patch and the internal grooves of the barrel, created small depressions and scratches on the surface even before the shot. This was not failure. It was an intentional part of the process. These prior deformations meant that the bullet was already structurally compromised before leaving the barrel. When the explosion of the gunpowder pushed the bullet down the barrel at high speeds, these small imperfections served as starting points for subsequent expansion. The soft lead not only yielded to impact, it was already prepared to yield, pre-weakened by the loading process itself. Soldiers did not consciously know this, but their bodies executed the process with a brutal precision that had been refined through decades of trial, error, and carnage. What happened in the first milliseconds after impact was not visible, but it was felt. When the high-velocity soft lead bullet met resistance, tissue, muscle, bone, the frontal surface began to flatten instantly. There was no elasticity. The lead did not ricochet, did not maintain its spherical shape. The force of the impact compressed the front of the bullet, while the rear continued to be pushed by momentum, creating a progressive deformation that transformed the sphere into an irregular mushroom. This expansion happened in fractions of a second, but its consequences unfolded in centimeters of torn tissue. The bullet entering with the diameter of a hazelnut created an internal tunnel 3-4 times larger than its original size. The malleability of the lead meant that each impact produced a unique deformation. No two projectiles expanded in the same way. If the bullet struck dense muscle, it flattened in one way. If it encountered bone, it fragmented partially, creating irregular tips of lead that broke off and followed independent trajectories within the body. If it penetrated fatty tissue, it maintained some cohesion but slowly widened, creating a wider but less fragmented channel of destruction. Soldiers who shot at wooden targets after battles retrieved deformed bullets and kept them, not as trophies, but as objects of morbid study. Each recovered bullet told the story of its trajectory through its final shape. Flattened into a disc meant impact on a hard surface. Elongated and twisted meant it had traversed multiple tissues of different densities. Fragmented into irregular pieces meant it had hit bone directly. The expansion created a cavitation effect, a pressure wave that propagated through the surrounding tissue, destroying cells far beyond the direct path of the bullet. The soft lead, as it deformed, did not cut a clean path. It pushed, crushed, tore. Tissue that was not directly touched by the bullet still suffered cellular rupture from the shock wave the deformation created. This is why soft lead musket wounds had a much larger internal diameter than the entrance wound suggested. Field doctors described the phenomenon as deceptive wounds, small on the surface, catastrophic internally. And the cause was not just the velocity of the projectile, it was the malleability. It was the lead's ability to transform kinetic energy into physical deformation. It was exactly what the soldier's hands felt when shaping, testing, and loading the bullets. That yielding doughiness, that inability to resist pressure, reproduced on a lethal scale within the human body. The entry wound rarely revealed the internal devastation. A soft lead musket wound might have a clean, almost circular entry hole the size of a silver coin. But what happened internally transformed tissue into something that field doctors described as ground meat. The irregularity began centimeters below the surface of the skin, where the deformed bullet created unpredictable trajectories. Unlike iron or bronze projectiles that maintained a relatively stable shape, soft lead flattened, twisted, and changed direction upon encountering bony structures. Surgeons probing wounds in hopes of finding a straight channel discovered that the metal probe diverted, encountered pockets of lateral destruction, and bumped into fragments of lead that had broken off from the main projectile. There was no predictable geometry. Each wound was a unique labyrinth of torn tissue. The internal texture of the wounds was what most disturbed the doctors. Iron bullet wounds left relatively defined edges, a cut through the tissue, brutal but geometric. Soft lead wounds left macerated, irregular edges, as if the tissue had not been cut, but crushed and torn at the same time. When surgeons attempted to bring the edges of the wound together for suturing, they found that the tissue no longer met. There were spaces, gaps, areas where cavitation trauma had completely destroyed the cellular structure. The skin could be stitched, but the muscle beneath remained in a state of progressive disintegration. Cells damaged by the pressure wave continued to die days after the initial impact. The wound expanded from the inside, out necrosis spreading in dark patches beneath the skin that, on the surface, appeared to be healing. Internal bleeding was what made these wounds lethal even when they did not directly hit vital organs. The irregular deformation of lead created multiple points of vascular laceration, not a clean cut in an artery, but dozens of small tears in capillaries, smaller veins, tissue membranes. This type of bleeding was difficult to stop because there was not a single source. It was diffuse, distributed, infiltrated. Blood accumulated in pockets between muscles, creating deep bruises that compressed nerves and caused radiating pain that the injured described as burning that migrates. Doctors tried to drain these accumulations, but without precise understanding of the damaged internal anatomy, they often perforated adjacent areas still intact, creating new bleeding points. The irregularity of the wound made each surgical intervention a calculated risk. There was no protocol. Each case required improvisation based on what the metal probe encountered while blindly probing inside the body. Extracting a soft lead bullet was often impossible. Unlike rigid projectiles that maintained cohesion and could be located by a probe and removed whole, the deformed lead often fragmented into irregular pieces that lodged at unimaginable angles within the body. Surgeons inserted long metal forceps into the wound, following the path that the probe had mapped, but what they found was inconsistent resistance. Sometimes soft metal that yielded under the pressure of the forceps. Other times, fragments so deformed that they slipped from the tips of the instrument. The tactile sensation conveyed through the forceps was like trying to hold wet soap. The lead, even within the body, retained its characteristic malleability. Squeezing the forceps too hard further deformed the fragment. Not squeezing enough allowed it to slip away. The pressure had to be calibrated in real time, through the tactile feedback traveling through the metal shaft of the forceps to the surgeon's fingers. Fragments that could not be removed remained. Surviving soldiers from musket wounds often carried pieces of lead lodged close to the spine, between ribs, encapsulated in scar tissue around joints. These fragments became part of the anatomy. The body attempted to isolate them by creating a fibrous capsule, but could never completely expel them. Over time, the lead began to slowly dissolve in bodily fluids, releasing metal ions that accumulated in adjacent tissues. War veterans developed symptoms that doctors of the time could not connect to the fragments: chronic joint pain, tremors in the hands, persistent fatigue. The lead continued to work years after the impact, slowly poisoning through imperceptible chemical dissolution. The hands that had molded the bullets did not know they were creating not only acute wounds, but chronic poisoning that would last decades. The texture of the scars left by these wounds was recognizable to the touch. Scars from soft lead wounds were not linear and smooth like surgical scars. They were irregular, wrinkled, with areas of depression where the subcutaneous tissue had been destroyed and never fully regenerated. Running fingers over these scars revealed a topography of destruction: ridges, small craters, fibrous cords where the body had attempted to fill gaps with dense, disorganized collagen. Surviving soldiers learned to recognize each other by their scars, not visually, but by touch. In dark wards, hands found the scars of wounded comrades, and by the irregular texture, they knew. That was soft lead. That was musket. That was what their own hands had manufactured, tested, carried. The sensory cycle closed, from lead melted in palms to the irregular scar under fingers. The complete bodily memory of proto-industrial violence etched in skin, muscle, and bone. Permanent, indelible, irreversible. So the next time you hear someone talking about soft lead bullets in a period film, you know, it was not a random choice of material, it was trauma engineering. Those calloused hands shaping bullets around the campfire were literally manufacturing small pieces of metal, programmed to become something much worse as soon as they encountered resistance. And the most disturbing? The guys making the bullets were the same ones who would end up getting shot by them. Leave it in the comments. Did you have any idea that the malleability of lead was exactly what made these bullets so destructive? Or did you think it was just because lead was cheap and easy to melt? Curious to see how many people really understand the brutal physics behind these things that we see as old and outdated technology.